Navy is warning that it can shoot down another surveillance drone, just as President Trump is expected to increase sanctions on Iran. The sanctions come only days after the president backed off a plan for airstrikes in retaliation for the downing of the U.S. unmanned drone. Both the New York Times and Washington Post are reporting that the same day President Trump called off those military strikes, U.S. Cyber Command was conducting online attacks against an Iranian intelligence group that American officials believe helped plan the recent attack on oil tankers in the Strait of Hormuz and in the Gulf of Oman. This morning, a top Iranian official acknowledging the U.S. cyber attack, but claiming they were not successful. NBC's chief foreign correspondent, Richard Engel, is on the ground in the region in Doha, Qatar. Richard, is this more than the usual tit for tat in dealing with Iran? How do you put this situation in perspective for us?
Oh, I think it's much more. Something is absolutely afoot. If you just look at where the top administration officials are going right now. I was listening to your conversation earlier. You were talking about getting inside President Trump's head. He makes a threat one day, dials it back, brags about showing restraint. Then the cyber attack is launched. What is his messaging? But if you leave President Trump's logic and his rationale and his thought process aside for a second, and you look what actually is happening in the Middle East, particularly here in the Persian Gulf, there is a lot of activity. Secretary of State Pompeo today in Saudi Arabia, later going to the UAE. John Bolton, the National Security Advisor in Israel over the weekend. So you have the two top officials, arguably, on foreign policy, on Iran, meeting with some of Iran's biggest enemies. All of this leading up to the G20 summit. So far, if you listen to the comments that have been made publicly by Bolton and Pompeo, they're talking a lot about maritime security. That is, how to improve security here in the Persian Gulf. And there was an interesting comment just a short while ago from the U.S. envoy to Iran, or the U.S. envoy for Iran, Brian Hook. He gave a press briefing to some reporters in Oman. And he also talked about increasing maritime security and said that there is an attempt by the U.S. right now to build an international coalition against Iran to try to find an international security framework for maritime security here in the Persian Gulf and in the Straits of Hormuz. He didn't give any details of what that plan would be, but strongly suggested that all of these trips, all of this shuttle diplomacy right now going to Iran's biggest enemies is an attempt before the G20 to come up with a plan to confront Iran, to try and internationalize somehow the Straits of Hormuz and the maritime traffic here in order to prevent even further escalations.
Richard Engel, thank you for that. Let me bring in former U.S. Ambassador Christopher Hill, Kevin Barron, executive editor of national security website Defense One, and former State Department senior advisor Nayyera. Let me just start with the whole idea of consistency or lack thereof. And we see these movements now with Pompeo and Bolton. Let me get your take on where we are with all of this right now, and the president in particular backing down with just 10 minutes to go, Ambassador.
Well, first of all, I think the administration is trying to show it's got a higher purpose to all this. So what better purpose than maritime security? After all, we're a maritime nation. Many countries depend on open seaways to get their energy supplies. So I think it's shifting the focus to try to say, hey, in addition to everything else, the Iranians are attacking maritime security, and maritime security is important to everybody, including most of the G20 countries. You know, foreign policy is often used as a proxy for being tough, for being wise, or for being compassionate. And I think the president has tended to use it as to show he's tough, but in fact this didn't look very tough. So now he's going to try to be tougher with the issue of cybersecurity. And as for the travels of Pompeo and Bolton, this is an effort to go to our really shop-worn allies in the region, especially the Saudis, and to say, look, we're still on board with this. We're still going to come after your nemesis, Iran. I mean, what is really lacking, of course, is any kind of meaningful channel to Iran. I mean, Iran has been around for a long time, and we need to be a little more serious about what their interests are, what their interests are not, and what our expectations are.
Yeah, and we should note that the president just, I think within the last hour, tweeted about all this and talked about why are we protecting the shipping lanes for other countries for zero compensation. But Kevin, let's go back to the messaging, because I do wonder what some other allies are taking away from this. And the president was asked about his decision to pull back. Here's what he had to say.
Everybody was saying I'm a warmonger, and now they say I'm a dove. And I think I'm neither. You want to know the truth. I'm a man with common sense. I have John Bolton, who I would definitely say is a hawk, and I have other people that are on the other side of the equation, and ultimately I make the decision, so it doesn't matter. John Bolton is doing a very good job, but he takes generally a tough posture. But I have other people that don't take that posture. But the only one that matters is me, because I'll listen to everybody, and I want people on both sides.
So I think that's his bottom line, isn't it, Kevin? The president says Bolton's hawkishness doesn't matter because Trump, makes all the decisions anyway. In your many years of covering these kinds of actions, where do the president's current tactics land on whatever scale we're judging by?
Well, you know, he said Bolton is the hawk, but others that are advising him are not. Well, we found out this week, and the Wall Street Journal reported, the other one who was not is General Dunford, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the top military advisor to the president. He's the one who said, who exercised caution, who wanted to exercise caution with military strikes. You know, I think Ambassador Hill touched on something when he focused on this new messaging point on maritime security. Maritime security is the base level that the United States can relate to any country in the world. It's how the U.S. Warms up with China when there's thaws. It's how you warm up with any nation. You try to just set the basic rules for shipping and security for trade. If that's the level of cooperation, I mean, that's the lowest hanging fruit possible. But it's the result of the way that this entire episode started, 8 weeks ago now, by announcing through a John Bolton statement that the U.S. was going to send an aircraft carrier and suddenly get real tough on Iranian terrorist activity and, with shipping missiles covertly, threatening sea lanes. And it's all exploded to where we are now. So I don't think there's been a huge walk back of policy. I think there's been a lot of message confusion. There have been these, threatening incidents like the shipping attacks. But it's all the same. The Trump administration is going to, they say, be tougher on Iran when it comes to illicit weapons, distribution around the region and those shipping lanes, not just at the Strait of Hormuz, but around the Horn by Yemen, where the U.S. was supporting, the Saudis against the Houthis and against the Iranian missiles there. And trying to build that coalition that quietly the Pentagon had been trying to build for some time now. And now you're right, the ambassador's right, it's in the hands of the diplomatic side and Pompeo to try to come up with a better, more secure and a public lane to Tehran that does get a lot more support. I'll say last thing, watch NATO. This week the NATO defense ministers are meeting. It's a regular meeting, but it's the first one for the new acting defense secretary Esper. He's got to go there on Wednesday and Thursday, defend these policies and win a coalition.
Well, let's talk a little bit about people we normally depend on, Nayyera, which includes NATO, an organization that the president has often been critical of, and certainly some of the individual member nations. Where are we with diplomacy, and where are we with having a coalition that can be built that can avoid something catastrophic here?
Well, the use of the word coalition is fascinating with this administration because it does certainly harken back to the coalition of the willing that John Bolton tried to create during the Iraq War. That's part of why the United States called a meeting of the UN Security Council today, which on that council are many of the countries that are still part of the Iran deal. That includes Germany, that includes England, includes China and Russia. We haven't talked about the Russia angle here. We know that Trump administration is working directly directly with Israel and directly with UAE and Saudi, which are the sworn enemies of Iran. But Russia, which is a signatory to the deal, is the ally of Iran. They have created a lot of challenges for the United States in their support for Iranian activities throughout the region. This is going to be a far more complex negotiation and discussion than how Donald Trump handled the belligerence of North Korea. Iran has been a bad actor for a long time, but the purpose of diplomacy is to separate out discrete things that you can work on and solve, and then address different pieces at another time. That was the purpose of the Iran deal. That not unclear then what the purpose is of this focus on maritime security, because it's not going to stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. It's not the regime change that Bolton has asked for. So it looks like it's a pretense for something else that potentially could be a flare-up in the entire region.
Meantime, you have the United Nations calling for further investigation into Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's role in the murder of Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi. So Chuck Todd asked the president about that, and here's how he responded.
The United Nations said they'd like the United States to order the FBI to investigate Jamal Khashoggi's death and possibly MBS's involvement in it. Will you allow the FBI to do that?
I think it's been heavily investigated.
By who?
By everybody. I mean, I've seen so many different reports.
What about?
If you're going to look at Saudi Arabia, look at Iran, look at other countries, I won't mention names, and take a look at what's happening. And then you go outside of the Middle East and you take a look at what's happening with countries, okay? And I only say they spend 400 to 450 billion over a period of time. All money, all jobs, buying equipment.
That's the price. As long as they keep buying, you'll overlook some of this behavior.
But I'm not like a fool that says we don't want to do business with them.
Ambassador, let me get your reaction to that.
It's very clear he doesn't want to look at the Khashoggi murder. He's kind of thrown everything into the relationship with the Saudis. The hope is, of course, the Saudis will convince other actors in the Middle East to go along with the Jared Kushner plan, which last I checked is not doing very well in terms of attracting people to his conference in Bahrain. So I think overall the president is just saying he's doubling down on Saudi Arabia.
But is the message, Ambassador, is the message there is a price at which that if we do enough business with you, then we can overlook certain things?
Well, clearly, and the president is also planning to sell arms to the Saudis and not consult with the Congress, which would be rather unprecedented. And I think we're going to get a view of whether we have a Congress that's willing to stand up for its prerogatives and its oversight responsibilities.
Ambassador Chris Hill, Kevin Barron, Nayyera Hawk, great conversation. Thanks to all of you. And this morning,